Lao Tzu sounds convincing in a very specific way, not because he argues aggressively or builds rigid systems, but because he dissolves them. He speaks about flow, about non-resistance, about aligning yourself with a natural order instead of forcing outcomes. The language is calm, minimal, almost disarming. It gives the impression that the deepest truths do not need complexity, that wisdom is not something you construct, but something you stop interfering with. And that is exactly where the appeal comes from, because it offers relief. In a world that feels structured, demanding, and often overwhelming, the idea that you can step out of constant effort and simply move with things feels not just attractive, but correct. It feels like you're finally seeing through unnecessary struggle. You're no longer forcing, no longer controlling, no longer trying to dominate reality. Instead, you're aligning with it, letting things unfold, acting without strain. At a distance, this looks like clarity. But the problem begins the moment you try to apply it in situations that are not calm, not balanced, and not naturally self-correcting. Because Lao Tzu's philosophy assumes a kind of harmony in the structure of reality itself. It suggests that if you stop interfering, things tend to move toward balance. That force creates resistance, that control creates distortion, and that the most effective way to act is often to act less, to interfere less, to allow processes to unfold without imposing rigid intention on them. That idea works in certain domains. It works in situations where systems are already stable, where small adjustments are enough, where overreaction creates more problems than it solves. It works in personal states, where overthinking can create tension that disappears when you stop trying to control everything. It works in moments where stepping back allows something more natural to emerge. But real life is not consistently structured that way. There are situations where nothing moves toward balance unless something actively pushes it there. There are systems that do not self-correct, but instead reinforce their own imbalance. There are conditions where inaction is not neutrality, but a form of passive acceptance of whatever is already happening. This is where the philosophy begins to strain, because the principle of non-action or minimal action does not clearly distinguish between situations where restraint is intelligent and situations where it becomes avoidance. It assumes that forcing outcomes is generally the problem, but in many cases, the absence of force is the problem. Not all systems resist intervention. Some require it. And once you encounter those situations, the clarity of the idea begins to dissolve. You're left trying to decide whether to act or not act, whether to intervene or allow, whether resistance is necessary or harmful. But the philosophy itself does not give you a clear way to make that distinction. It leans heavily in one direction toward non-interference, without fully accounting for the kinds of situations where that approach fails. This creates a kind of practical ambiguity. You begin to interpret passivity as wisdom, restraint as depth, non-engagement as alignment. And sometimes that interpretation is correct. But other times, it becomes a way of avoiding responsibility, of stepping back in moments that require clarity and action. The difficulty is that from within the framework, both can feel similar. Both can feel like you are following the same principle. This is where the philosophy starts to blur important differences, because not all effort is distortion, and not all control is unnatural. There are forms of deliberate action that do not fight reality, but shape it. There are moments where clarity requires decision, where direction requires commitment, where outcomes depend on whether you step forward or remain passive. Lao Tzu's framework tends to understate this. It emphasizes harmony, but it does not fully engage with conflict. It emphasizes flow, but it does not fully account for friction. It suggests that the highest form of action is effortless, but does not explain what to do when effort is unavoidable. And in real life, effort is often unavoidable. You are placed in situations where something has to be decided, where consequences follow from inaction as much as action, where allowing things to unfold is not neutral, but directional. And in those moments, the idea of simply aligning with the natural course becomes unclear, because the natural course is not always stable or beneficial. Sometimes it is chaotic. Sometimes it is destructive. Sometimes it is shaped by forces that do not correct themselves. In those cases, stepping back is not wisdom. It is withdrawal. This is the tension at the center of Lao Tzu's philosophy. It works best in environments where balance already exists or can easily reemerge. It struggles in environments where imbalance is persistent and requires intervention. And because it does not clearly separate these cases, it can lead to a kind of overgeneralization, where the same principle is applied across situations that demand very different responses. That is why it feels profound at a distance, but uncertain in practice. It captures something real about the limits of force and the value of restraint. But it extends that insight into a broader claim about how to live that does not always hold when conditions become complex, unstable, or resistant to passive alignment. Once you try to live this philosophy consistently, the difficulty is no longer theoretical. It becomes a problem of judgment, not whether non-action has value, but when it does, and more importantly, when it doesn't. And this is where Lao Tzu's framework begins to feel less like guidance and more like an unresolved tension. Because the central idea of acting without forcing sounds clear until you are placed in a situation that demands a decision under pressure. In those moments, the distinction between forcing and necessary action is not obvious. It is not something you can recognize instantly. It requires interpretation, and that interpretation is exactly what the philosophy tries to minimize. It encourages you to trust the natural course, but it does not give you a reliable way to identify what that course actually is when multiple outcomes are possible. This becomes especially visible in situations involving conflict. Lao Tzu's approach tends to dissolve opposition rather than confront it. It favors yielding over resisting, softness over hardness, indirect movement over direct assertion. In certain cases, this is not only effective but strategically superior. It allows you to avoid escalation, to redirect energy rather than collide with it, to outlast rather than overpower. But this only works under specific conditions where the opposing force is sensitive to that kind of response. Not all forces are. There are situations where yielding does not dissolve conflict but reinforces it, where stepping back does not create space but signals weakness, where indirect action is simply ignored. In those cases, the logic of non-resistance begins to break down because the system you're dealing with does not respond to balance. It responds to pressure, to boundaries, to clear and sometimes forceful intervention. This is where the philosophy becomes difficult to apply without distortion. Because if you remain committed to non-forcing, you risk allowing situations to develop in ways that become harder to correct later. But if you step in with force, you move against the principle that defines the philosophy. And there is no clear internal mechanism that tells you when that shift is justified. The framework does not provide a stable threshold where non-action becomes insufficient and action becomes necessary. So the burden falls back on individual judgment. And once that happens, the system loses the simplicity that made it appealing in the first place. You're no longer following a clear principle. You are navigating a gray area where the principle itself becomes one factor among many, rather than the decisive guide. This does not make the philosophy useless, but it does mean it cannot function as a complete approach on its own. There's also a deeper issue in how Lao Tzu treats intention. The idea of effortless action suggests that the most effective behavior arises when you're not imposing rigid goals on the situation. You respond instead of controlling, you adapt instead of directing. But in many areas of life, intention is not optional. It is what allows you to organize effort over time, to commit to a direction, to build something that does not exist yet. Without intention, action becomes reactive. You move in response to what is happening, but you do not shape what will happen. And while this can reduce friction in the short term, it can also limit your ability to engage with projects that require sustained direction. Building anything complex, whether it is a skill, a relationship, or a system, involves moments where you cannot simply flow. You have to decide, persist, and sometimes push against resistance. Lao Tzu's framework tends to interpret that pushing as a deviation from alignment. But that interpretation is not always justified, because resistance is not always a sign that you are moving against reality. Sometimes it is a sign that you are engaging with it at a deeper level. The difficulty is not evidence that the action is wrong. It can be evidence that the action matters. This is where the philosophy risks encouraging a kind of selective engagement. You remain fluid where things are already moving easily, but you withdraw where they are not. You interpret ease as alignment and difficulty as misalignment. But real life does not divide itself that cleanly. Some of the most meaningful outcomes require sustained effort precisely because they are not immediately aligned with existing conditions. If you rely too heavily on the idea of effortless action, you may avoid the very situations that lead to growth or transformation. This creates a subtle but important limitation. The philosophy optimizes for harmony in the present, but it does not always account for change over time. It helps you move smoothly within existing structures, but offers less clarity on how to reshape those structures when they are inadequate. It encourages adaptation, but it can weaken the drive to intervene when adaptation is not enough. And this leads to a kind of imbalance. You become skilled at navigating what is, but less capable of altering what should not remain as it is. You reduce friction, but you also reduce the capacity to confront it directly. You achieve a form of internal calm, but sometimes at the cost of external effectiveness. None of this means that Lao Tzu is simply wrong. It means that his philosophy captures one mode of engagement extremely well, the mode of restraint, of sensitivity, of non-interference, where interference would create unnecessary distortion. But it extends that mode too far into areas where a different kind of response is required. And because it does not clearly mark those boundaries, it leaves you in a position where you have to reconstruct them yourself, which brings you back to the very complexity the philosophy seemed to remove. At this point, the issue is no longer whether Lao Tzu's ideas contain truth. They clearly do. The real question is what happens when a partial truth is treated as a complete guide, because that is where the philosophy begins to create problems, not in what it sees, but in what it leaves out. Lao Tzu identifies something important about the limits of force. He recognizes that excessive control can distort situations, that rigid intention can create resistance, and that not every problem is solved by pushing harder. These are real insights, and in many cases they are corrective. They pull you away from a mindset that assumes effort is always the answer and that control is always necessary. But the problem is that this correction becomes a direction. Instead of balancing effort with restraint, the philosophy leans toward restraint as the default. Instead of treating non-interference as one option among many, it elevates it into a general principle. And once that happens, you begin to interpret a wide range of situations through a single lens. This is where distortion enters, because real life requires multiple modes of engagement, not just one. There are moments that call for patience and moments that call for intervention. There are situations where stepping back allows things to resolve themselves, and others where stepping back allows problems to deepen. A framework that does not clearly distinguish between these cases will inevitably misfire when applied broadly. Lao Tzu's philosophy tends to blur that distinction. It suggests that harmony is the underlying state of things, and that disruption comes from interference. But that assumption does not always hold. There are systems that are not naturally harmonious, structures that persist in imbalance, dynamics that do not correct themselves without deliberate action. In those cases, non-interference does not preserve balance. It preserves whatever imbalance already exists. This is where the idea of alignment becomes difficult to interpret, because if the world does not reliably move toward harmony on its own, then aligning with its natural course is not necessarily a solution. It may simply mean adapting to conditions that require change. And without a clear account of when to accept and when to alter those conditions, the philosophy leaves a gap at the center of decision-making. That gap has practical consequences. It can encourage a form of passivity that feels like wisdom. You avoid unnecessary struggle, but you also risk avoiding necessary action. You remain open and flexible, but you may also become directionless. You reduce friction in the short term, but allow larger problems to persist over time because they are never directly confronted. This does not happen in an obvious way. It happens gradually through interpretation. You begin to associate effort with error, resistance with misalignment, intervention with disruption. And as those associations deepen, your range of possible responses narrows. You become increasingly inclined to step back, even in situations where stepping forward is required. At the same time, the philosophy does not fully account for the role of structure. Flow is meaningful within a system that already has some form of order. It allows movement without obstruction, adaptation without collapse. But where that structure is weak or unstable, flow alone is not enough. Something has to establish boundaries, create direction, impose constraints that allow this system to function. Without that, what you have is not harmony, but drift. And drift is not neutral. It follows existing pressures, existing imbalances, existing forces that are already in motion. If those forces are constructive, drift may appear beneficial. But if they are not, then drift simply carries things further in the same direction. Lao Tzu's framework does not fully engage with this distinction. It privileges responsiveness over construction, adjustment over formation. And while that works within stable environments, it struggles in situations where stability itself has to be created. It offers a way of moving within the world, but a less clear way of shaping it when shaping becomes necessary. This is why the philosophy can feel profound at a reflective level, but uncertain at a practical one. It provides insight into how to reduce unnecessary struggle, but does not provide a complete account of how to deal with necessary struggle. It encourages you to let go, but does not fully explain when holding on is required. It values balance, but does not always show how to respond when balance is absent. The result is not that the philosophy fails completely. It is that it operates best within a limited range of conditions where the world is already close to the state it assumes. Outside of those conditions, its guidance becomes less reliable because the underlying assumptions no longer hold. This is where a more complete view begins to emerge. Non-interference is not a universal solution. It is one tool among others. It is useful when force would create distortion, when systems are self-correcting, when stepping back allows clarity to emerge. But it is insufficient when systems are unstable, when imbalance is entrenched, when outcomes depend on deliberate and sometimes forceful action. Recognizing this does not mean rejecting Lao Tzu. It means placing his insight in context. Instead of treating flow as the highest principle, it becomes one dimension of a broader approach. You retain the ability to step back, to avoid unnecessary control, to move with situations when that is appropriate. But you also retain the ability to step in, to create structure, to act decisively when the situation demands it. That balance is more difficult than the simplicity Lao Tzu offers. It does not give you a single guiding rule. It requires judgment, awareness, and a willingness to move between different modes of action depending on the conditions. But it also aligns more closely with the reality of how life actually unfolds. Because life is not always something you can simply flow with. Sometimes it is something you have to shape. And a philosophy that cannot fully account for both will always feel incomplete when you try to live it beyond its ideal conditions.